Okay, how do you make toast? Take a second, visualize that, or write it down in some of your little notebooks here. And how do you make toast? Did anybody think of a toaster? Right. Plug it in, put the toast in, push it down, make toast. How about getting the bread, getting a slice of bread, putting it in the toaster, and having the toast? Or how about going all the way back to the store, buying the toast, going back home, putting it in the toaster, and making toast? And I know all of you here had a human throughout that entire process, right? But in Europe, they don't use toasters. They use frying pans. So as you can see, the process of making toast, as simple as it sounds, is very, very different, and the perceptions of individuals are constantly different, right? So as you can see from these pictures, how you make toast really goes down to our unconscious bias of how we actually have created toast in the past, or cultural differences like the European making toast in a frying pan. The challenging thing is it's not too unlike most organizations when they make toast. A lot of times they have a hard time having a shared vision of what they're trying to accomplish. How many here are kind of reminiscent of the siloed group that we see on the screen up here? Very, very siloed. In the case of this example, say a digital transformation. IT is highlighted here. They're kind of driving the initiative, but look at all those disconnected spots there. Very, very challenging to have a cohesive shared vision. Even so much so, Forrester has came out and said 65% of organizations that have a challenge with this is because of a lack of shared vision. A shared vision unifying the group together to move forward. It's extremely difficult, and I'm sure some of you are going through those pains right now as we speak. Diane mentioned it earlier this morning, having that shared vision and value and goals. So the next iteration of that is this cohesive view into the organization, a shared vision and value at the center. Now, this could be a shared vision and value with customers, or it could be a shared vision of your organization and your employees. So make sure we look at this as two lenses. Again, though, you're probably wondering, it's pretty easy to put a bunch of circles on a pie chart together and make it all happen, right? Very difficult to do it in the organizational, with all the organizational politics and changes or challenges we have today. So how do you go about doing this? We're going to get a little bit tactical here today. I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper into the world of what we call service design. In order to do that, though, you got to look at the big picture, right? The big picture, and again, Diane mentioned this earlier, is how do we look at that full scope of the organization? All the way from what we're used to today, the customer experience. And then we talk about the employee experience, the front interactions that those individuals have with customers or employees. Then we have all the backstage individuals, the people you don't see, running around in the backstage, making sure everything's working together. Then they have all that technology processes. Now, like we talked about earlier, that siloed organizational group and approach, you usually look at these as that horizontal swim lanes, right? How many of us have put together customer journeys and focused on that without including all of those individuals? Same thing with technology, same thing with processes. They tend to look at those initiatives in a digital transformation in those swim lanes. With service design, though, we can start orchestrating all of those pieces together. But it's very, very challenging. So I'm going to break down service design a little bit, a little quick 101. So service design makes up a series of touch points. We all love the 5 Ps, whether that's from marketing or in service design. They're made up of people, process, place, props, and partners. All of those represent an individual touch point that you would have inside of an organization. Inside of that, we have what's called the front stage. Those customers, those employees that touch the customer. And when I say employees or customer touch point, that could be a digital experience, it could be a chat, it could be voice. It doesn't necessarily need to be human, as we see today. Then we have the backstage. So the backstage is where all the magic happens, right? They support all of those front stage interactions. Those backstage employees doing the work needed, as well as the backstage processes in order to support technology, organizational processes, functionality that needs to happen with the side of the organization. Service design is able to orchestrate all of those instead of a siloed horizontal view into a much more vertical view. So you take that slice, you line that up with the shared vision we just talked about earlier. That's how you can actually execute along that track vertically and make sure all of those organizational individuals are aligned to move forward faster. That's the part of accelerated service design model we have today, leveraging that shared vision. With that, though, you identify a series of service gaps and challenges and opportunities. So you're probably wondering, what do I do with all of those? How do I go about making those better? How do I go about making those ways of working better? Well, you ground service design in design thinking. Now, I know Diane mentioned this earlier too, so I'm going to do a little 101 on this as well. Design thinking is a way to do problem solving, and it's a methodology that allows you to not only imagine, visualize, and mobilize, but it creates the new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching problems. So I'm going to break it down really quickly. So the first step is empathize. Who is the audience and what matters to them? Then we define, so what's the point of view? And where are their needs? Then we ideate, which is a lot of design thinking when we get into the ideation of the workshops. How might those needs be addressed? Then we prototype, and I want to define prototype a second. Prototype can be a digital, physical prototype, but it also can be a simulation. It can be a conversation. You want to simulate that experience or the point of view you want to address. It can be any fidelity. And then we test. So we apply the design thinking methodology, and again, I said it wasn't a process, so this isn't a stepped approach. This is actually an iterative process that you're going to be going through, again, the divergent and convergent thinking throughout the entirety of it. We apply that design thinking into what we call total value, and you've probably seen these as well. You break down those ideas and test those iterations through what we call desirable, viable, and feasible. Desirable is human value, what matters to the individual, what's going to make the customer want to do this. Viable is business value, so does the business receive value? And then feasible, this is the challenging one, can organizations actually execute it? Now, we love that little spot in the center, that's where the magic happens, but a lot of times organizations are going to pull levers. So those levers can be pulled on a series of, hey, we want to be more desirable, we want to be more viable, or we want to be more feasible. And they can start to target how their initiatives are drawn there. Now, I wanted to make one thing a little bit kind of touch on from a standpoint of design thinking in the industry, as probably well of you guys have gone through some design thinking workshops and some design thinking initiatives in your organization. One of the challenges is, as Diane was mentioning, is embedding that design thinking individual into your processes, into your groups, to drive those new ways of working and new ways of thinking. Just as you would a personal trainer, you need a design thinking individual to make sure you're doing the right things. Otherwise, we're going to get into that section of going back to our old habits. So you're probably asking yourself, how do we leverage service design integrated with design thinking to empower and own and co-create and sustain transformation? And I think the key words here is accelerate and scale. It's really difficult to scale that across the organization. So how do we do that? Well, we apply a experiential formula. That formula has what's called drive behaviors. So we want individuals, just like we walked through that make toast example, understanding what those behaviors need to be to drive the new changes that we want. Then we are going to be implementing probably new processes to implement those behaviors. You combine those two, and you enable new ways of working, which is where the service design really starts to drive home. Because service design is all about how organizations get work done. But in this case, we're combining that with the behaviors we want to drive those individuals. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first you need the individuals involved, right? We talked about that example up front of that pie chart, very disconnected. How do you bring all those individuals? What are those individuals that can drive those initiatives? Well, senior leaders. We all know and love our senior leaders. They're going to be able to embody and orchestrate that change from a high level, right? The real work begins when we deal with the three lower ones. We call them drivers, designers, and refiners. These individuals are basically on the front stage, front lines of the organizational change and transformation. They lead by example, but they have to be taught how to do that as well. The challenging thing, though, is there's tons of things that need to happen inside of a transformation from an internal organizational shift. So how do we do that? Well, just like, and you may recognize some of this, from an agile process, we break down all of the individual tasks that need to be implemented inside of the organization. We break down all those behavior changes, process changes, and to enable those ways of working. So we break those down and we do design thinking rolled around those tasks to create how might we statements. Some of you may have been through those before. Those how might we statements are bubbled up into what we call narratives. Those narratives become the storytelling. Another key piece Diane mentioned earlier, all of us being the owners and drivers of storytelling, the power of storytelling. Then those are bubbled up into what we call epics. Those are large initiatives that we can basically put our hands around to basically walk through the organization. We take all of that great design thinking knowledge and stories for change, we put that into what's called an experience curriculum. Basically, it's a models of educate, apply, and enable. Let's take, for example, empathy, the first step of design thinking. We would educate individuals around those drivers, designers, and refiners around empathy, doing things like empathy mapping, not only with your customer, but with other groups of the organization, getting those how to make toast perceptions out of the way, the unconscious biases. Then we apply those, so they actually dive deeper into creating empathy maps, which really starts to make them feel what empathy really means. Then we actually enable them to take those types of tools and activities with their groups to drive that change in the organization. That's where scale comes from. It's the biggest challenge with any transformation, scale. Whether you have 100 employees, whether you have 60,000. Scale is the most difficult thing to do. So how do you actually implement that? Well, we implement it through a series of what we call major and minor touch points. Kind of what we talked about earlier with service design. But we involve those three main individuals, those drivers, designers, and refiners throughout the organization. First of all, defining that modules that we talked about earlier, the curriculum, with the drivers, getting them stabilized. Then we roll in the designers. Those designers then give feedback loop back up to the drivers to whether or not those behavior chains are applicable in the real world. Then we loop in the refiners, which is all the rest of the individuals. And then you can see near the end how all of those groups come together. That co-created, cohesive, cross-functional change throughout the organization. This is where scale and acceleration happens. So taking all of the design thinking, service design, all of those individual elements, putting into the curriculum and executing it across the organization. So you're probably wondering, how can you leverage new ways of thinking and new ways of working into your organization? It's pretty simple. You just got to ask yourself one question. How do you make toast? Thank you.